Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock. As of this recording, it is March 3rd, 2025. Hope everybody's doing well out there. Thanks for tuning back in. Last episode, we talked about communist ideology, what it springs from, some of the core tenets, and we also talked about Vladimir Lenin's take on it. In this episode, we're going to see how those ideas play out in the real world, and spoiler alert, it's not great. All right, so quick recap on what we were talking about last episode. Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels. Both were Germans. They were philosophers and economists, political theorists, if you will. And they developed the foundational ideas of modern communism. Engels, he comes from an industrial family, and he provided financial support and intellectual partnership with Mr. Karl Marx. Together, they co-authored the Communist Manifesto and other works like Das Kapital, which critiqued capitalism and outlined their vision for a revolutionary transformation of society. Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, they were alive and operating in the 1800s. Karl Marx, he lived from 1818 to 1883. Friedrich Engels, he lived from 1820 to 1895. If you had paid attention in history class, or if you listened to the last episode, then you know that during this period of time, the mid to late 1800s specifically, there was this little thing called the Industrial Revolution. All right, there were cities all over the world, but especially in Europe, and they were Germany, Paris, London, to name a few, and they were highly industrialized, meaning there was a shit ton of factories and a shit ton of other industries that required a shit ton of workers to slave their asses away in horrible conditions. Basically, you had the super poor worker class, i.e. the proletariat, slaving away in just absolutely horrific conditions. They worked like 12 to 16-hour days. There were no bathrooms. They worked in horrible, hot conditions a lot of times. They were so poor that they raked in maybe $10 or $15 a week. Entire families would slave away in these factories. Not just adults either, kids. Kids would clock in 10 to 12-hour days. A lot of them would be apprenticed, and I'm saying that with air quotes. And they were a commodity because, one, you could pay them less than adults, and two, they had a lot of maneuverability with tiny hands and tiny bodies into machinery. And oftentimes they would get seriously maimed, injured, or otherwise killed. It was pretty common for these children as young as 6 working in these conditions to get their arms cut off, get their appendages crushed, get their bodies crushed. A lot of them died, and there was no recourse that anybody could really do. Like, you couldn't sue for liability. There was no insurance. There was no workers' comp for these workers. It was just like, oh, something happens, that sucks, that's on you. We've got a whole bunch of other poor proletariat that are just waiting to work because otherwise they're starving in the slums. And that's the other thing. A lot of these people lived in slums, horrible, just hellholes that were full of pestilence, rats, roaches, scabies, lice. They slept on straw. There was no family time. It was just work, go home, take a nap in your horrible digs, go back to work until you died of disease, exhaustion, malnutrition. All right, you get the idea. So the crux of the issue for Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, seeing this happening in the mid-1800s, in the mid to late 1800s, is that basically capitalism is creating what they call surplus value, meaning you've got these machines and you've got these workers and they're producing a ton of crap. And the problem is that there's not enough capital going back into the hands of the workers. So there's not enough people writ large buying the products that are produced by this industrial system, this capitalist system. All the wealth, as they see it, and probably true for the most part, was going into the hands of the owners who owned the means of production. And the wealthy owners of the means of production are what's called the bourgeoisie, or A lot of times you'll hear it called bourgeoisie. I think the correct pronunciation per the French is bourgeoisie. The bottom line is that you had these huge class disparities, okay? And Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx were saying, well, this isn't anything new. History is just one nonstop tale of conflicting social classes, right? You had the freemen versus the slaves. Then you had serfs and nobility class. And now you've got the proletariat, i.e. the workers, and the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production. And this capitalist system that they're observing back then is not only just exploiting people, but it's also creating a system where, because capitalist industries are being forced to compete with each other, they're seeking the edge in two ways primarily. One, machinery, which will increase efficiency, and two, squeezing the labor harder. And two outcomes are going to come out of that. Either the machines are going to offset the workers and cause them to be unemployed, okay, which they call the reserve industrial army, and two, it's going to increase the class disparities and cause what they term class antagonism. And basically, it's going to get so bad that there's enough displaced workers who are either slaving away or unemployed, and they're so angry that the conditions are going to be ripe for a revolution which overthrows the capitalist system altogether. Once this revolution occurs, the proletariat will necessarily have to centralize leadership into what becomes known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Once they have control, they're going to wield the state to do, among other things, the following: abolish private property and the means of production, levy heavy progressive taxes on the rich, abolish inheritance rights, confiscate property for anybody who flees or resists, centralize the banks, centralize the means of communication and transport, nationalize the industrial and agricultural base, make everybody work, abolish the distinctions between urban and rural populations, and also provide free education for all children and abolish exploitative child labor. So that last one, most people, I think, are down for, but the other ones, it's whenever you have the word centralize or nationalize, and you've got something that's being referred to as the dictatorship of the proletariat, then you've got a problem. Marx and Engels say that after the proletariat have seized the means of production, then ultimately class distinctions will disappear, and the state will also disappear, and it will be replaced by a, quote, free association of producers. Engels goes so far as to say that, quote, the state is not abolished, it withers away once class rule ends and production is socialized, end quote. Alas, Marx and Engels die. They never see the revolution occur. Okay, fast forward 1917, interstage left, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He's basically of the opinion that capitalism has evolved into imperialism by the time that he's operational, right? 1917. And what's going on in 1917? World War I. As he sees it, the great nations fighting in World War I, that is France, Germany, Russia, and Britain, are basically duking it out because really what's at stake is their access to colonies. What's colonies provide? The colonial holdings that these countries have provides, one, resources, and two, markets to keep capitalism afloat. Marx and Engels suggested that capitalism was on its last leg and that it would collapse under its own weight. Lenin says, no, imperialism has postponed that process because now they're exploiting whole populations abroad to keep the capitalist system going. As it turns out, for Lenin, there is a pretty good opportunity to incite a communist revolution in Russia. Russia at the time is considered a backwater show compared to the rest of Europe because they hadn't industrialized to the same extent as Germany, London, and France had. As a result, they had a lesser proletariat population, but they had a huge peasant population. Lenin says, hey, we don't need the mass proletariat population that Karl Marx and Engels talk about. We just need the proletariats that we do have to lead the peasants, because there's 80% peasants in Russia. There's millions, tens of millions of peasants in Russia at the time. and they're all disgruntled. And everybody's pissed at Nicholas II, and they feel like he's operating on antiquated assumptions such as divine right to rulership. So Lenin says, hey, if we give the peasants the land, then they will be on board. Once we have the proletariat on board with us as well, we'll be an unstoppable force. In order to get the proletariat to actually do what needs to be done, there has to be a vanguard. The vanguard party is going to be committed to this revolutionary cause. Their whole life, they're going to die for it because that's the only way that it can happen. And for Lenin, this vanguard party is going to be led by him and his comrades, the Bolsheviks. And basically, once the ignition is hit in Russia, it's going to blow the powder keg worldwide, and all these countries across the world are going to follow Russia's example. They're going to rise up, and there's going to be a global revolution that casts off capitalism and replaces it with socialism and then communism. Just to quote what he said real quick, quote, "The state will wither away as a natural result when there are no longer any classes in society to be held in subjugation. The dictatorship of the proletariat is merely a plank in the bridge between capitalism and socialism, and then between socialism and communism, when the state will die out," end quote. He also said, quote, "The socialist revolution is not a single act, not even a single war on a national scale, but a period of political and economic upheavals, of class struggles on a world scale, embracing a whole epoch of years, perhaps even decades," end quote. Lenin also makes it clear that the only way this is going to go down is through violence, plain and simple. He says, quote, "The proletariat needs state power, the centralized organization of force, the organization of violence, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to lead the great mass of the population, the peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie, and the semi-proletarians in the work of organizing socialist economy," end quote. Okay, so you get the gist, all right? And if you listen to the last episode, you've already heard it all, but bears repeating, I think. On April 3rd, 1917, Lenin is in exile in Switzerland, but he returns to Russia via a sealed train arranged by the German government, which hoped to use his revolutionary rhetoric to destabilize Russia's shaky government and knock Russia out of the war. And spoiler alert, it worked 100%. But I'm going to take one step back, and we're going to talk about what was going down in March. Okay, so on March 8th, 1917, thousands of workers, many of them women, actually, went on strike in Petrograd, protesting bread shortages and terrible living conditions. Soldiers and sailors sent to crush them and quash the rebellion actually joined them, and many of them mutinied. This was the beginning of the end for Tsar Nicholas II, who was not doing well politically, and also it's worth noting that the Russian military situation in World War I at this time was really not great. They had sent millions of peasants to get slaughtered in the killing fields of Eastern Europe fighting the Germans. And people were really demoralized for various reasons that we're not going to get into. All that you need to know is that Tsar Nicholas II was really, really unpopular with not only the people, but also a lot of people in his government. So on March 12th, politicians in the Russian parliament, which is known as the Duma, formed a committee to restore order and negotiate with the Tsar regarding the protests that were taking place in Petrograd. Nicholas ordered the quashing of protests, but again, the troops refused to comply, and the uprisings actually spread beyond Petrograd to other cities like Moscow. On March 14th, Nicholas's top generals basically said, "You gotta go, man. Like, this isn't gonna turn out well for you. You need to abdicate the throne." They warned he would spark a civil war, basically, if he stuck around. So on March 15th, recognizing that he lacked the political and military support to remain in command, he abdicates the throne, fearing for his wife and his 5 children's safety. Tsar Nicholas Romanov II and his family were placed on house arrest, and spoiler alert, it doesn't turn out well for them. Okay, so in lieu of the Romanov dynasty ruling the nation of Russia at this time, a provisional government is formed. And basically, it declares that it's committed to democracy, civil liberties, and continuing World War I in support of Russia's allies, which were France and Britain. It pledges to convene a constitutional assembly to establish permanent government, but it also refuses to enact any immediate reforms like land reform, which kind of pisses off the peasants who want something done immediately. Okay, so the peasants are pissed. What's new? All right. Well, what's new is that the peasants are pissed, but you don't have the strong iron hand of the Tsar crushing peasant uprisings, wielding the secret police, and utilizing his autocratic rule to keep things functioning per status quo. And the status quo was 300 years of brutal Romanov rulership. All right. So you've got the provisional government. Okay. And basically, the name that you need to associate with the provisional government is a guy named Alexander Kerensky, who takes control of the provisional government July 1917. On the other side of this equation, and equally powerful, is what's called the Petrograd Soviet. And basically, it's a council of elected representatives that are supposed to represent working class and military people, and it's dominated by socialist factions. And there's a lot of different socialist factions that range from the Bolsheviks under Lenin, which is extreme, to more normal, socialists that are just like, hey, maybe we should just have a little bit of reform here, and the government can step in where industry is failing us, and with democratically elected leadership, we can organize a situation that's better for us, for the workers, but also, isn't, overthrowing and killing the bourgeoisie. Now, without going super deep into the nuance of why this was doomed to fail, I'll just point out some of the highlights, all right? And basically, the provisional government was unelected and self-appointed. It did not have a clear mandate from the Russian people. It relied on the goodwill of the Duma, which was the Russian parliament, which had limited credibility due to the fact that for years the Tsar had been suppressing the Duma's ability to do anything. So even though it existed, the people didn't really see it as anything that was going to hold weight. That was like the immediate problem that occurred is, yeah, you've got a provisional government, but nobody really feels much allegiance to it. And also, it's been undermined since its inception, so nobody really even thinks that it can do anything in the first place. Second, it's got to contend with the Petrograd Soviet. Because it had strong military support, it often undermined the edicts of the provisional government. So this rivalry paralyzed decision-making and ultimately eroded the government's ability to govern efficiently and effectively. Furthermore, people were really, really, really ready for Russia's involvement in World War I to be at an end, but the provisional government was still pushing for the war and waging the war despite multiple military setbacks, resulting food shortages, and just widespread disillusionment with the whole situation. On top of all this, you had terrible inflation, food scarcity, and it was just setting all of the perfect conditions for just total nuclear meltdown, which is imminent at this point. Inside the pro-worker and pro-military Petrograd Soviet, you had competing factions within that group as well. There were the Mensheviks that favored cooperation with the provisional government, whereas Lenin's Bolsheviks pushed for its overthrow. This ideological split basically was going to reach a boiling point, as we're going to see. It's only important to know that not all of the socialists were revolutionary. A lot of them were just like, hey, can't we just have a little bit of reform here? But like I've said, Russia was backwards. They didn't know what to do. It's perfect conditions for all hell to break loose, which I've said already, but it really breaks loose. All right, so Alexander Kerensky, who was a socialist himself, decides that what's best for the Russian situation is to initiate another offensive on the Eastern Front. That, not so surprisingly, fails absolutely miserably, and leads to massive casualties and basically a near total collapse of morale in the military. The military was done. They didn't have a government that they trusted, believed in, or cared for, and people were getting sent to the slaughter still. So they were done. From June to August 1917, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with Alexander Kerensky and his provisional government. So a conservative general leads a coup against the provisional government, but Alexander Kerensky, needing some muscle, calls on Lenin and his Bolsheviks to help fight off the coup. So interstage left, Lenin and his Bolsheviks, they fight off the coup. Now they're armed because they were armed to fight off this coup, and they're victorious. So they've gained significant credibility. And once they've got a foothold, they never let go. The provisional government basically erodes. On November 7th, 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and his right-hand man, Leon Trotsky, they launch the revolution. They seize the government. I don't think there was a single shot fired. There might have been, maybe, but there was no significant military struggle. They just were like, all right, we're done. We're done. As a result of the Bolsheviks seizing control of the government, Russia quits World War I in March 1918. It basically gives up vast territories to Germany and takes the L, but says, okay, well, now that we're done with that, we can focus on our internal enemies. So the members of the provisional government are arrested. Alexander Kerensky himself, however, escaped, but these political opponents are basically viewed as representatives of bourgeoisie interests and defenders of capitalism. Okay, so then, hours after they overthrow the government, there is the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets. That's where they abolished private ownership of land without compensation, transferring estates to peasants. And so really all this was the legalizing of the peasants to overthrow the bourgeoisie and also the wealthier peasants. Violent peasant mobs would ransack through the countryside, going into the mansions on these estates, taking whatever they wanted, brutalizing whoever was there if they felt like it, and then they took control over the entire land that was formerly controlled by whatever rich person or rich family happened to own it. Now, as you very well may imagine, that's a pretty terrifying prospect, right? Dozens, a couple dozen, hundreds of angry peasants are now given full legal authority to go and ransack your house and take whatever they want and do basically whatever they want to you. It was just a total breakdown of law and order. If you were a class enemy, you better hope that the peasants didn't hate your guts, because if they did, you're screwed. And a lot of the bourgeoisie were royally screwed. So the peasants are rampaging through the countryside, and there's no media to cover it because the Bolsheviks shut down newspapers that were aligned with the bourgeoisie, liberal or moderate socialist factions. And if you weren't directly associated with the Bolsheviks, you were considered, quote, a counter-revolutionary. Counter-revolutionary means that you're against the Bolsheviks. Doesn't matter if you're ideologically somewhat aligned. You're not with them, then you're an enemy, a class enemy, and you're screwed. Journalists, editors, politicians, anybody who helped shape public opinion, they were silenced. They were either arrested, executed, or they were sent to the gulag, which really, if you think about it, that's all the same thing. Like you're either arrested and executed, or you're arrested and sent to the gulag where you're probably going to die. On December 20th, 1917, the Bolsheviks created the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, aka the Cheka, aka the Secret Police. This was led by a dude named Felix Dzerzhinsky, aka Iron Felix. They were tasked with identifying and eliminating counter-revolutionaries, a broad category, as I've mentioned, that included czarist officials, aristocrats, clergy, capitalists in general. That's anybody. If you own a store, if you were wealthy enough to own a store, you were considered a capitalist, you were a class enemy. and anyone suspected of opposing Bolshevik rule. Okay, that's basically everybody. Unless you're an avowed Bolshevik, you could be very easily suspected, or just somebody might hate you and just make an accusation, and now you're pretty much screwed. The early actions that they took included mass arrests, interrogations, and summary executions of prominent figures from the old regime and suspected saboteurs, of course, right? Who isn't a suspected saboteur when you're seizing everything and taking control of everything? Bolsheviks began seizing banks, factories, private enterprises, and urban properties of the wealthy were requisitioned and used for workers' housing. The wealthy owners of those properties were basically displaced and moved to slums, cramped into these rooms where it would be like a family of 10 in one small room. They had no heat, no amenities, and in the cold, freezing winter of 1917, many of them froze to death. Lest we forget that with something like this, there's a total breakdown of law and order, and even if you're not a Bolshevik per se, you could pretty much get away with doing anything. And there was tons of local looting and violence that occurred against property owners. Sanctioned or unsanctioned, didn't really matter. There's a total breakdown of law and order. As Lenin sees it, class enemies are going to pay no matter what, so who cares if it's the Cheka, the Bolsheviks, or just disgruntled people that have a chip on their shoulder and want to take it out on somebody who's wealthier than them. And if this doesn't make a shiver crawl down your spine, then the Red Terror will. All right. So you've got a total breakdown of law and order. You've got mass rioting, looting, murder, rape, pillage, whatever you once owned, you don't own anymore. Whatever place you once lived in, you probably don't. If you were rich, you better act like you're poor, because people are going to be spitting on you. They might beat you. Everybody hates you. It was bad. But then in 1918, somebody tries to assassinate Lenin. This is where it gets really crazy. It was already crazy, but this is where it gets really crazy. So crazy that it becomes an event in history known as the Red Terror. Okay, red because they're commies and commies wear red, but also red because a ton of people are going to die and it's really bloody. Okay, so the Red Terror was formalized after an assassin tried to kill Lenin on August 30th, 1918. The guy who tried to do it, his name was Fanny Kaplan. He was a socialist revolutionary. He was like, hey, this has gone far enough. We've experienced an entire winter, spring, and most of the summer of just total chaos. This is absurd. This has got to end. I'm going to take out Lenin. Lenin gets shot a couple times. He's messed up, but he lives. And so they take the advantage, and the Bolshevik leadership put out a decree on September 5th, 1918, titled On Red Terror. Yep. They literally called it Red Terror, and it basically authorized the Cheka to arrest, imprison, and execute enemies without trial. So before this, you had, individual bad actors or people that you could point to because of whatever specific thing they might have done, and then that's how they were targeted. But at this point, entire social groups were gathered up based on their class status, and suspects were expanded not just to the normal people, right? But basically, if you were an intellectual, if you were a priest, or if you were linked to a foreign power, if you had a relative in the United States or Germany or anywhere else that was opposing what was going down in Russia at this time, they just called you a suspect, and you were basically sent off, and you were summarily shot, bayoneted, hanged. It was horrific. There's one case that I heard about where they were torturing somebody. It's the classic, like, hey, if you give up the rest of your comrades, then we'll give you a quick and easy death. And he's like, but I don't have any comrades, because he's actually innocent, right? So they put this dude in a barrel full of nails, roll him around in it. Eventually, he's going to say whatever they want to hear. They go find those people. They're now suspects. Repeat that cycle a couple times. And now you've got a whole lot more people that you can murder because they're suspects, right, against the Bolsheviks. Oh, yeah, and by the way, a lot of these executions were public, and oftentimes they would hang the bodies, or they would mount a decapitated head on a spike and leave it there for days or weeks so that the public would see what happens when you stand against the Bolsheviks. Other types of torture that the Cheka would use beyond the general psychological torture of parading bodies around was they would basically boil your hand and then peel your skin off. They might flay you alive. They even would lock prisoners in rat-infested cells so that the rats would eat you alive. I mean, just absolute bonkers, horrible stuff. The Bolsheviks would also seize the relatives of suspected enemies and use them as leverage, very much like what Hamas does, right? Take a bunch of hostages. Oh, yeah, and the Viet Minh, for that matter. Take a bunch of hostages and then use them for leverage. Oftentimes, if demands weren't met, these innocent hostages would be executed. And if we're being honest, being executed was probably on the brighter side for these hostages, because let's be real, how well do you think the hostages of the bourgeoisie were being treated by the diabolical Cheka secret police or just any Bolshevik that happened to be operating because they could? By 1919, the Cheka had established a network of labor camps. This was the precursor to the Gulag, and this was where counter-revolutionaries faced forced labor, starvation, and disease. Conditions were deliberately harsh to break prisoners physically and mentally. Now, remember how Lenin married his wife in the Gulag, or, whatever, the political prisoner camp that he was in, but he was allowed to hunt, fish, and write, and also get married, and presumably that means, do some other not terrible things with your loved one, right? If you get what I'm saying? Well, that's not the conditions that these people were put in. They were forced to do hard labor, and oftentimes they would live on 300 calories a day. Yep, you heard me, 300 calories a day. Your only crime was being a class enemy who all of a sudden was on the wrong side of a horrible event in history, and you're doing manual labor, cutting down trees, and doing all kinds of other stuff all day long, and you're getting 300 calories a day. So what happened? Yes, people died in droves. What about your kids? What happens if you have kids? Well, often families were separated, children were sent to state orphanages to be re-educated. Entire families split apart. Okay, so up to this point, I think you get the gist of it. From 1918 to 1922, the Red Terror. The psychological toll was immense, and enough, I would say, to drastically transform the superego of the Russian population. We haven't even gotten to Stalin's reign of terror or the psychological toll of World War II, which, as you'll recall, left 12 million Russians dead. That's including military and civilians, with 12 million Russians. And just for reference, the United States lost like 300,000 people in World War II. And I'm just throwing that in there because if you think about the superego concept, right, this is 1918. We haven't even gotten through Stalin or World War II. Okay, so anyway, anybody and everybody, even if you were a Bolshevik supporter, you could never be sure at this point that somebody wasn't going to make a false accusation against you, okay? Everybody lived in terror, waiting and watching and seeing neighbors, friends, acquaintances, family members just disappear. Who knows what would happen to them? Maybe they were shot. Maybe they were imprisoned. Maybe they were just lynched by a mob. In some cases, there was unsanctioned violence that occurred when civilian supporters of the Bolsheviks would attack class enemies in unsanctioned purges. And it was just pure terror. People lived in absolute dread of the night when somebody's going to come knocking, and you know that when they do, your family's going to be broken apart. You're going to be taken away. You're not going to know what's going to happen to your family members. They're probably going to be tortured, killed, sent to a death camp to work their asses off until they die. Just absolute pure terror, exactly as planned. Lenin's modus operandi: use terror to crush class enemies and quote-unquote counter-revolutionaries. Okay, so I'm just going to take a moment to read a couple diary entries that I came across in my research. The first is going to be by a guy named Nikolai Ustryalov. He was a lawyer. He writes in his diary, "The nights are the worst. Shots echo from the Lubyanka, and we wonder who's next. My office is gone, my clients vanished, and I trade my old suits for bread. I don't fight them, I just wait. Another gentleman, his name is Ivan Mnuchin. He was a physician in Petrograd who stayed and was there during the Red Terror, and he never openly opposed the Bolsheviks, but he did write in his diary recounting a time that the Cheka raided his apartment because they suspected him of hoarding medical supplies. He says, quote, "They took my stethoscope, my books, everything but my life. I said nothing. What could I say? Silence is my shield," end quote. In the end, he avoided execution by offering his skills to the Bolshevik regime, and the rest of his diary is just full of despair over friends disappearing, and he doesn't know what happened to them, whether they're executed or sent to a work camp, but he continued to live in a state of muted compliance. Muted compliance to me is a very a troubling term, but that's what we saw widespread everywhere. Just a lot of people didn't write about it or document it, because if you had that kind of thing discovered, boom, done, sent to the work camp. Like, it's not even worth it. Who cares, right? At that point, who cares if anybody hears your side of the story? You just want to live. All that to say, there was an opposition, and it was called the White Army. The White Army, as opposed to the Red Army, was a coalition of monarchists, liberals, conservatives, socialist factions that were opposed to the Bolsheviks, as well as foreign powers. The British, France, United States, and Japan all were on the side of the White Army. This led to a crazy, massive civil war. In order to fight the White Army, the Red Army utilized what is called war communism. Basically, it's the forcible seizing of grain stores to feed the troops, and any other supplies that the army might need, they get, right? We see this same kind of thing happen with the Viet Minh in Vietnam, but it's where communism basically comes into play. Because they have such strong control and centralized leadership, they can get away with taking whatever they need from the populace, and the populace isn't going to do much about it, because if you do anything about it, you're going to get executed or sent to the work camp. Due to the fact that the Red Army was requisitioning the grain stores from the peasants, this triggered a man-induced famine and therefore ignited sporadic peasant uprisings. Discontent peasants who were now starving would rise up, and they would get violently crushed, oftentimes with artillery and poison gas. I gotta say, even though this is the first instance where this happens, this ends up being like classic commie stuff. They're your friends until they're not, and then when they're not, you're an enemy, and when you're an enemy, your life sucks or you're dead. That's it. For some brief examples of the kind of massive slaughter that would occur, there's some documented instances where thousands of people were killed in the course of 1 week. At Sevastopol, Ukraine, 8,000 people were killed in 1 week in 1920. At Simferopol, 12,000 were executed. At Yalta, another 5,000 were killed. Historians estimate that the Red Terror killed between 50,000 and 200,000 people, though figures vary widely due to incomplete records and the chaotic nature of that civil war. The higher estimates often include indirect deaths from famine and disease and displacement caused by the Bolshevik policies. Now, in case you didn't get the point, I'm just going to conclude here with a few quotes from Lenin. Quote, "We must execute not only the guilty, execution of the innocent will impress the masses even more." End quote. Another quote, "The road to socialism lies through a sea of blood. We must drown the counter-revolution in that sea, or it will drown us." End quote. And I'm going to read a quote from Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the Cheka, from 1918. He says, quote, "We stand for organized terror. This should be frankly admitted. Terror is an absolute necessity during times of revolution." End quote. So after all this carnage, chaos, terror, torture, and pure hell, the famine that was caused by all of this killed between 1 and 5 million, with 3 to 5 million being the common range suggested in scholarly works. 3 to 5 million resulting from famine due to this chaos that was created by Lenin and his Bolsheviks. Okay, so there's one last topic that we need to briefly discuss, and that is Lenin's vision of the global revolution, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier. So to help facilitate this global revolution, he creates an organization called Communist International, more commonly known as Comintern. And the stated aim of this organization is pretty straightforward. He says, quote, "The victory of the proletarian revolution on a world scale is the practical task of our international," end quote. In the summer of 1920, he declared at the Second Congress of the Communist International, quote, "Every party wishing to belong to the Communist International must systematically remove reformists and centrists from all positions in the working class movement," end quote. By the summer of 1921, several communist uprisings in Germany and Hungary, spurred on by Comintern, had failed, and Lenin pushed for a united front with non-communist workers. Temporarily, of course, to build strength. Does anyone remember another communist organization that used the United Front line to consolidate strength? Anyway, by the Fourth Congress held in 1922, Lenin was suffering from numerous health ailments, but the Comintern was going strong. It was doubling down on the anti-colonial struggle, specifically targeting Asia and Africa. Starting to see the connection here to Vietnam? So here's where the real tie back to Vietnam comes in. Ho Chi Minh attended a meeting in France in December 1920 where Lenin's Comintern emissaries demanded loyalty to Moscow, and this created a break from the reformist socialism that was common in France. After this meeting, there was a split between the leftists in France, between the socialists and the communists. Ho Chi Minh, who was inspired by Lenin, wrote in his autobiography, quote, "It was Lenin's theses that brought me to Marxism. I realized this was the only path to liberation," end quote. By mid-1920, Ho Chi Minh joined the French Communist Party, which was freshly aligned with the Comintern. This meant that it wasn't just a membership card, but now Ho Chi Minh is plugged into Moscow's communist network. In 1923, Ho Chi Minh took the next step and traveled to the Soviet Union, and he enrolled in the Communist University to learn revolutionary tactics and Marxist theory. In 1924, he was sent as an agent to China, where he worked under Soviet operative Mikhail Borodin, and he organized the Vietnamese exiles living in China and founded the Revolutionary Youth League, which laid the groundwork for what became the Communist Party of Vietnam in 1930. I think you can see the link now between Ho Chi Minh and the Bolsheviks. Ho Chi Minh was a revolutionary from the earliest days of the Russian Revolution. He learned his communism in the Soviet Union, and he operated under the Comintern in China on behalf of the global conflagration that Lenin envisioned occurring. Further down the line, we'll talk more about Ho Chi Minh's link to the Soviet Union, but just remember, he learned his communism from the Soviet Union under Lenin's tutelage, specifically through the Comintern, and that's all for now, okay? So back to Lenin. Lenin, like Marx and Engels, shockingly, did not live to see the global revolution, the communist uprising, nor the communist utopia. Lenin died in a small village near Moscow at the age of 53 on January 21st, 1924, due to a series of strokes. Interestingly enough, it was a series of strokes over the course of about a year that finally did him in. The first occurred May 1922 and left him partially paralyzed and temporarily unable to speak. He recovered for a brief period, and then he experienced another stroke in December 1922, which further impaired his ability to lead. And a third and final stroke occurred March 1923, and left him bedridden, mute, and effectively incapacitated for the last 10 months of his life. An autopsy revealed that some of the arteries in his brain were so calcified that they were described as nearly stone-like. This condition is definitely likely to have contributed to his strokes. There have been theories, however, that he may have had syphilis or been poisoned. Notably, Stalin suggested that he may have been poisoned. But, alas, these remain speculative and lack conclusive evidence. Most historians and medical experts today attribute his death to natural causes tied to a known history of vascular disease. After his death, Lenin's body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square, where it remains on display to this very day. And with that wonderful thought of Comrade Lenin lying in a state of revered secular sainthood, I leave you to contemplate the nature of justice and legacy. The next episode will go into the immediate aftermath of Comrade Lenin's passing and pick up where this revered gentleman left off with another revered gentleman known as Comrade Joseph Stalin. If you thought the Red Terror was bad, it doesn't stop here. It only gets worse. But alas, history is full of wild and brutal tales. And so I look forward to descending deeper into one of the darker realms of human experience in the next episode. Until then, thanks for tuning in. And be free, everybody. Count your blessings and give thanks if you live in the United States or the Western world, because I can assure you the alternative is much, much worse.